Welcome, everyone. My name is Ginger Elliott-Teague. You are hopefully here for the last webinar for the end-of-year training, data collection training for this current fiscal year. If you went to the in-person training or if you have listened to one of the webinars that we held a couple of weeks ago, this material is exactly the same. It's just repeated. We're offering it several times so that everyone gets a chance to hear it. We now have the webinar posted on our special education data website, our data pages, and we have a copy of the slides on that page also if you want to look at those. We have a few other resources on there too that we'll talk about in a little bit that you will probably want to access at some point. So at this point in the year, you have about a month and a half left to complete all of your end-of-year reporting. So we'll walk through what that looks like, what you need to do, either as a refresher for you if you've done this in the past or for new information. So we'll go ahead and get started. So we have to, there we go. We have to collect this data because of federal reporting requirements. The Office of Special Education Program tells us what we have to collect, how to collect it, how to measure it, and so forth. So we do what they ask. Oklahoma as a state is judged and scored for its compliance with this, with the data submissions. They assess whether it's been timely, whether it's accurate, whether it's complete. So we need all districts to follow the same guidelines and requirements because we cannot be timely, accurate, and complete as a state if districts aren't also. So that's why we set those requirements. That's why we offer bonuses for districts that complete everything on time because it's very important to the state as a whole. We are judged and scored for those things. If you are ever interested, you can see the results from previous years, our determinations, and differential monitoring results that we have as a state. You can find those on a website called osep.grads360 if you're ever interested. And the information is up from the previous 3 years. So let us know if you ever want to look at those or if you just want to go searching for those. We'll gladly point you in the right direction. So that's why timely, accurate, and complete district data is good for all of us. It's good for you guys and it's good for the state as a whole. So we're going to pull end-of-year data from EdPlan late on July 1. So we will be using the advanced reporting reports that you can see. We pull the same information from the same reports that you use. So you will have until 9 a.m. on July 1 to clean up your data. Okay, we ask that all reports be reviewed by then. We ask that your district summary data page be completed by then. If your district summary data page is not completed by July 1, it will be considered not timely. So make sure you get that done. Superintendents then can certify starting July 2nd through July 16th. Okay, and we'll review a little bit about certification again at the end. But just make sure that all of your data are entered or reviewed by July 1. So today we'll be talking about two particular sets of data that are submitted or reviewed in different ways. We'll cover certification and we'll very briefly look at some of the AR reports so that you at least have a sense of which reports we'll be pulling. So the first set of data we'll be looking at, we collect through the district summary data page. And that is the 45-day timeline. Some of you may call it child find, indicator 11, compliance. The early childhood transition data, any information about CEIS participation. CEIS stands for Coordinated Early Intervening Services. If you don't know what that is, you probably don't participate. We only had 8 districts this year. So for most of you, that will just be zeros, but we'll talk through that. And then your personnel information. The rest of the data we collect at the end of year, we pull directly from EdPlan. It's student level data. You do not need to submit that, but we do ask that you review those reports to make sure that the information about your students is accurate and complete. So for that, we look at exiting, secondary transition, early childhood outcomes, and discipline. And we'll walk through all of those 8 data sets in just a moment. Okay, so a few notes before we get to that about data quality. We highly recommend you do a few things, look over a few things as you prepare your end-of-year data. First, LEA agreements and assurances, data assurances are due by June 30th. If you're not sure who completes these in your district, or if you know you don't, you need to figure out who does that. In the LEA agreement, there's a section where districts can record primary contacts for various things. And one of these, so there's the superintendent contact, there's special education contacts, finance contacts. We're reminding districts to check that the special education contact information in the LEA agreement is correct. We use that data set as our primary source of information for emails and names for special education, when we send out notifications, when we send out determinations, all of that. It's really important, especially at the beginning of the year, because we don't necessarily know who is coming in, who has changed positions, and so forth. So be sure to update those. In the past, we've had some special education directors listed in the LEA agreement that haven't been in office for 10 years or more. So it's really, really important that you check that names and email addresses are correct in there. We also ask that you update site codes at this time of year. So you need to go in and check that in EdPlan that the site codes listed for individual schools in your system are correct. And you can find those site codes on the state website. You should be able to find them from your superintendent's office, places like that. But those are really important. If they're not correct, it takes us quite a bit of time to review and find and correct those in the data sets. Also, although it's coming to the end of the year, it's important, if you get a Sooner Start referral, make sure that you talk to, usually only directors can do this, so if you know a Sooner Start referral is coming in, make sure that directors have been notified and that those records are activated. Most of the time, teachers, resource providers, your related services providers cannot see those records unless they've been activated. Last year we had 92% of Sooner Start records referred to districts, okay, and that's a very high rate of referral electronically. And those, of course, come to you as an inactive record. Only 60% of those were ever activated and reviewed. So we want to make sure that you are activating those. And then if it turns out to be a false referral, the family's not interested, you just inactivate those again. Exit codes. Make sure you do two things with regard to your exit codes. First, review any missing exit reasons. So you may need to do a couple things with those. If you have a missing exit reason, check the student history for the student. There most likely will be duplicate exits and reentry events. You need to delete those from the student history so that there is only one recent exit. The system cannot tell if there are multiple exits listed on a student history. The system cannot tell which exit is the correct one, so it doesn't pull data at all. So if you see a missing exit reason, first check the student history for duplicate events. Also, if you have any unknown exit codes, so a student, you have exited them with a reason as of unknown, make sure you review those at this time. Unknowns that are left on June 30th will be counted as dropouts. Okay, so be sure to look at those and check that they are resolved. For event timelines, we have some new reports that are available for you to use, particularly one called an Eligibility Timeline report. And that's a really useful tool, but it's not 100% complete. So what's happening on that report, we would love to use that for reporting purposes so you wouldn't have to submit your own data. Unfortunately, because of the way the data pulls on that report, if the timeline in student history is not precisely accurate, then data doesn't pull correctly. So if, for example, and it can be even the same day, so if you finalize a MEAGS, an eligibility determination, prior to finalizing the parent consent, it will throw off that timeline and it will look as if you are out of compliance. So you want to make sure that parent consent is always finalized prior to eligibility. There are ways to clean that up in your database and in the student history. So if you have any of those, give us a call. We can help you resolve that. But it's really important that moving forward, you make sure that each of those events is finalized in the correct order. Okay. So moving on to the district summary data page, this is data that you submit directly to us. We do not have good reports at this time to collect this data ourselves. So it's up to you guys to self-report this information to us. And we do that through the district summary data page. This is an administrator access only page in EdPlan. You go to the administrator dropdown, select the tab there, district summary data, and start to enter information. You can save this page at any time. You can update it at any time prior to July 1. So as long as it's complete by then, you can save and change it as many times as you want between now and then. We do ask that you enter zeros and empty boxes, so do not leave any empty boxes on that page, whether for personnel or anything else. We cannot assume that an empty box means zero. Instead, we assume that an empty box means incomplete information, okay? So you must put zeros in there so that we know that you are compliant and that you've entered everything you intend to enter. Please do that. Incomplete pages will be flagged as not timely and non-compliant. So this is one of those things that on the determinations and DDPs, we mark whether you were timely for end of year and child count. Well, for end of year, there are a few things that you must do to be considered timely. So you have to have the district summary data page completed by July 1. You have to have certification completed by July 16th. If you have any late eligibilities or late IEPs for early childhood transition, you will need to submit lists of those students to us. If you don't do that by July 1, you'll be considered untimely. Okay, so there are some really critical pieces that, because of the timeline that we have for submitting data, everything needs to be done by July 1. And if you get it done, then you will be timely. Even if there are slight errors that we have to resolve, we can work with you on those. Okay. So moving on to indicator 11, 45-day timeline compliance. This is a 100% compliance indicator, meaning that the state and all districts are expected to be 100% compliant on this. Very, very high bar, but this is what OSEP expects. So we have to report a count of delays and the reasons for delay in completing initial evaluations. And that starts counting from the day parental consent is signed. So there are two broad categories of delay. We have family reasons and other reasons. And we report those in the first section on the district summary data page. So this is probably a little bit hard for you to see just because it's so small. But if you pull up the district summary data page, you can look at that on your screens also. But the first box is your list of total referrals. Now, you will not enter a number here. It is an auto sum from the boxes below. So just make sure as you save it and finalize it that that number matches what should be in your records. Okay. So the first line is evaluations completed within 45 school days. This is your number of parent consents, referrals that were completed timely. So just enter that number. And again, these are just initial evaluations. Do not count reevals in any of this. For the second set, you would list any evaluations that were not completed timely. And there are really three categories that those fall into. So the first two we call family reasons, okay? And they are essentially excused. You are not held liable for what parents and families choose to do. So that's why we count those separately. We still need a count of those, but we essentially excuse them. So if you have a child who changes districts prior to completing eligibility, let's say you get the consent, it's signed, you save it as an event in Ed Plan, but the family moves prior to completion. You would report that here, whether it's a 1 or a 2, just list the count of consents that fall into that category, and you would just inactivate the student as transferred to another school district. Okay. You are responsible for reporting those if you sign consent. Now, if you are a district that has a student who has moved in after signing consent in another district, you must complete the eligibility, move on to the IEP in a timely manner, but do not report that because you are no longer liable for the compliance timeline once consent is signed in another district. Okay, the new district does not have to report it. The original district will report it. And that's important so we don't double count those initial evaluations. The second line, B, 2B, is parent failed or refused to produce the child. So just put however many fall into that category. The third line says parent refusal to sign consent for evaluation caused delays in evaluation. Well, we know that if parents never sign consent, then the timeline never starts. So this line is a holdover that we need to remove from the previous system, and this should always be 0 because, if they don't sign consent, then you don't start timeline. So just ignore that line, put a 0 in there, and move to the next one. So for 2D, you need to list any other evaluations that were delayed for any reason other than family. Okay. And what you do, so you put those in there, and then down below in those check boxes, if you have any information in 2D, let's say you have 1 that was delayed or 10 that were delayed, go down below and just check the boxes to record the reasons for that. Okay, so we don't need to know the number of those on this page, but we just need you to check those boxes. So whether it was failure to follow procedures or you didn't have resources or the calendar, whatever reason there, mark that down below. And this includes late referrals from Sooner Start. Okay, the districts are not excused for the 45-day timeline because of a late referral from Sooner Start. The last bit of information we need you to submit on this page, well, in this section for Indicator 11, is this box here. And it says, for all evaluations not completed timely, indicate the maximum number of days beyond the 45th day. So if you completed it on the 46th day, you would enter a 1. If you completed it on the 50th day, you would enter a 5. And we don't use this information ourselves as a state, but we are required to report it federally. OSEP wants to know across the whole state what was the most tardy evaluation. So we just report one single number and for the whole state. Okay, so we need to know what that number was for each district. For the 45 days, use advanced reporting report or the Ed Plan report for the 45 days. You should be recording your 45-day timeline separately. Okay, we do not have good reports. We have a couple of reports that could provide you information, but most districts record those and monitor those separately outside of Ed Plan, and we highly recommend that you do that. Subsequent IEPs that are out of compliance do not have to be reported here. So IEP timelines, we do not monitor IEP timelines for federal reporting. We do monitor them for different ways, especially, selective reviews, monitoring, compliance, other things like that. But for federal reporting, we do not report on IEPs, only timeliness for eligibilities. And that does not include reevaluations. These are only initial evaluations. Okay, any other questions? Again, we only count initial evaluations. If you have a Sooner Start referral and you choose to do additional evaluations, you must count them under 45-day timeline also because you are getting consent to do additional evaluation. So make sure you count those here also. So you would be double counting those in those two categories. Okay. Include all disabilities. So speech services are special education services. If you have any speech students that you get consent to do evaluations, you will be creating an IEP. You are doing an evaluation. You must count those for 45-day timelines. Okay? Now, for those other late evaluations, if you have any that were delayed for non-family reasons, you must submit a separate Excel file that lists the names and STNs of those students and the reasons for delay. Okay? We have to complete non-compliance checks for any district that has delays for non-family reasons. This is federally required. So to do that, we need you to give us that student information so we can check whether those were resolved and how the district is doing later. Okay, so it's really important you do that. We have a template that you can use. You will upload that to a document sharing tool we call Data Test, and we'll review that in a little bit. Parent requested evaluation, came in to sign consent, but then failed to return their portion of the required documents for the evaluation. It could be considered a parent reason, but it may depend on whether you could do the evaluation anyway. So if you can do an evaluation, the child is present, you can complete an evaluation without the parent there. You can't complete the rest of it, but you can complete an evaluation. So if you've notified the parent several times and they, you can move forward. So check with our program specialist about some of that. And parents' delays are not always actual reasons for delay. So that's something to consider. Okay, so early childhood transition. This is indicator 12. This is also a 100% compliance indicator. States and districts are expected to be fully compliant with this always. And so we have to report the counts of eligibility outcomes for kiddos who transition from Sooner Start, Part C, to a district. And if any of them are delayed, we have to report the reasons for delay. And so there's two broad categories. There's family refusal or declined services. There's also other reasons, just like for indicator 11. So under indicator 11, you'll see the boxes for indicator 12 on the district summary data page. Same process, just fill in the information. First box, again, is an auto sum box of the boxes below. Okay, quick question. Could you clarify about what you just said about speech with additional testing or reeval with additional testing? Do they count under the 45-day timeline? You only count initials. So if you have a student who already is receiving services and you do additional testing for a separate disability, that's not an initial, that's a reeval. Okay? You do not need to count that here. Only initial evaluations. So going back to indicator 12, okay, so the first line is, and these may seem out of order, I don't know, this is how we report them. The first line is kiddos who come from Sooner Start that you determine not eligible, but everything was done before the third birthday. Okay, so if you have two kiddos who come from Sooner Start, you decide that they're not eligible for Part B services, but you completed that eligibility before the child turns 3, count that here. The second line is the same sort of thing, but those who are found eligible, and everything is done before the third birthday. So 1 and 2 are your counts of timely completion. Line 3 is the only family reason we have for this indicator. So parent refused consent or declined services. So we know this happens fairly frequently. A district or a family will come in, you'll have the transition planning meeting with the family and Sooner Start, and then, a month later or something, the family says, I'm just not interested in services right now. So they decline services. You would count that here, okay? You never get to the eligibility, you may never get to the IEP, and that's the family's choice. So you would just record that under line 3. Now line 4 is a little bit tricky. We have 2 scenarios that districts need to account for regarding late referrals from Sooner Start. Okay, so let me walk through those 2 scenarios. The first one would be recorded here. So let's say you have a kiddo who comes to Sooner Start and they request services from Sooner Start really close to their 3rd birthday. So maybe they come to them, they're 2 years and 9 months old. Okay. So if they come to Sooner Start less than 90 days before their 3rd birthday, that is considered a late referral to Sooner Start. Okay. So there's nothing Sooner Start can do other than sign them up if they're eligible, provide them an IFSP, give them services for a month or so, and then pass them on to the eligibility determination for Part B. Okay? So it causes a really tight timeline for Sooner Start districts. If you have any of those, report them here under 4. It is considered excused if a family comes to Sooner Start within that 90-day window. Now, the other scenario is, let's say a kiddo comes to Sooner Start when they are 6 months old and they start receiving services then. If they start services with Sooner Start more than 90 days prior to their 3rd birthday, so they've been with Sooner Start at least 3 months, 6 months, sometimes 2 years, 2.5 years, but the referral doesn't come to you until that 90-day window prior to the 3rd birthday, that would be considered a late referral from Sooner Start. Okay? So these 2 scenarios are that a kiddo comes to Sooner Start late, or they are simply being served by Sooner Start, but they come to you late. If you have one of those, you would report that on the very last line. It would be 5, an IEP not completed on the 3rd birthday, not included in above groups, and 5 down below, late referral from Sooner Start. Okay, those are not excused. And the reason those are not excused, OSEP does not believe districts have leeway on this. They have stressed this to states. Because you get a notification at least 3 to 6 months prior to the 3rd birthday, OSEP believes that districts are liable for those late referrals. Now, sometimes it's because Sooner Start hasn't sent information to districts timely. We have found that those are actually quite rare. Usually what happens is that the family makes a very late decision that they want the referral. And so there's not much Sooner Start can do. They cannot refer without parent consent. And so if parents consent to the referral at a very late date, then the timeline is squashed for you guys, but you are still expected to meet that. So, fair or not fair, we won't judge that, but it is something that can, cause some stress for districts, and we understand it. But if that happens, you would report that down here, and it would be considered an other reason. Other reasons are not considered excused. For compliance purposes, you are liable for those, and you would be held accountable for them as being non-compliant. Okay. So again, just mark the boxes. If you have any that were late for non-family reasons or other reasons listed above, then you need to mark the reasons down below. And then finally, again, we need that date of the most tardy IEP or eligibility. So if you complete that 5 days after the 3rd birthday, put a 5 in there for us. And again, we just report this up to OSEP. We don't use that data ourselves, but we do need that from you so we can send up the number for the whole state. In previous years, for indicators 11 and 12, those numbers have been above 100. So there are some really late eligibilities and IEPs that have been completed for these indicators. So if you have a 1 or 2 day, that's pretty common, but those longer ones are what we typically report. Okay, a few notes on EC transition. There may be times when you have to consider the overlap in reasons for delay for indicators 11 and 12. So if you have a Sooner Start kiddo who comes in to your district with a referral and you want to do additional testing, you get the consent, and then you have to monitor both the 45-day timeline and the 3rd birthday timeline. So make sure you monitor both of those carefully. One may be late, but the other may not. They may both be late, or they may both be timely. But make sure you're watching that overlap between those, because you may need to report them separately. They may or may not have the same reason for delay, So just check on those because that can get a little bit confusing. And again, just like for indicator 11, if you have an IEP or a non-eligibility that is not completed by the 3rd birthday, you do need to report those student names to us, STNs, and the reasons for delay. Okay, we have a template for this also for you to fill out. We ask that you do it in an Excel file because it's much easier for us to collate the information. Last year we had over 100 districts that were delayed on both of these, and so that's a lot of information for us to review and check. We have to check each of those individual students' records to make sure that they are now compliant. So having that information is really important. If we don't get it right away, we will have to reach out to you and get the information for you. There's no question we have to have that information. We, as a state department, are not excused from that. So we cannot excuse districts from reporting that to us. So to submit that, hopefully most of you know about this, we created in everyone's ed plan a document sharing tool. That's what we call it. It's really a fake student, okay? First name data, last name test. So to find this kiddo, you search for a student just like you normally would. Last name test, open up the record, open up documents, and you can upload an external document to that fake student's record. Now we created this because we are not allowed to ask for student information over email, okay? We can't share PII, all of these FERPA regulations. We have to be very careful about how we work with and share student level information that could be compromised. So this document sharing tool is an extremely easy, straightforward way for us to share student information with districts. The moment you post it, we will see it immediately. So it's instantaneous document sharing. And we highly recommend actually that any time you need to share student information with us, you post it on here, you let us know that it's there, we can go in and pull it immediately and we can review it, okay? We can do that over the phone, online, however you want to do that. We can look at that information with you. If you do not find data test in your active student list, it's probably been inactivated because someone saw it and said, why is this strange student sitting in my active student list? I will inactivate it. Go ahead and reactivate that record if you need to upload data to it so that we can access that. Okay. Any questions, any other questions about data test or indicators 11 or 12? Okay. Moving on to personnel. So we have to report every year a count of full-time equivalents. So if you were to upload documents, you would be uploading the Excel sheets with the list of students that were delayed and the reasons for delay. So for personnel, we report a count of FTEs of related services personnel and paraprofessionals who serve students on IEPs for any amount of time during the week related to the student's disability needs, okay? So we'll go through this in just a moment, but there are certain categories that just because you have someone serving in that position in your district, it does not mean that they're providing specialized services to students with IEPs, okay? So there are 11 categories for related services. We have to report both fully certified and not fully certified. And then we have to report paraprofessionals, qualified and not qualified. And we report paras by age group. So what this means, we report by age 3 to 5 and then 6 to 21. So if you have a para working in a kindergarten class with both 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds who are on IEPs, then you would need to divide up the time that that para works with 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, okay? So maybe they work 40% of the time with 5-year-olds, 60% of the time with 6-year-olds. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you can estimate that if it's 50-50 or 10% and 90%, just make a solid estimate of that and report it that way. So with that exit question, we'll come to that when we talk about exiting. Okay. So with personnel, we have several categories that are pretty straightforward. We have audiology, speech language pathologists, interpreters, psychologists, OTs, and PTs, and down at the bottom of the list, orientation and mobility specialists. All of those are, they almost never provide services to general education students. These are exclusively employed for the benefit of your special ed students. So, fairly easy to calculate an FTE, when we'll talk about how to do that in a moment. If you have a psychometrist, report them as a psychologist, okay? PE teachers, social workers, nursing staff, counselors, these 4 categories are trickier to calculate and report. And that's because most districts have these staff on their personnel, but providing services to everyone in a school or everyone in a district. So, for example, a PE teacher. Last year, we had one district report that they had 5 PE teachers. So they put a 5 under fully certified. So that number stood out for a reason we'll get to in a minute. So I called up the district and said, do you really have 5 PE teachers who full-time work only with special education students, providing services related to their disabilities? And the director said, no, of course not. They're just our regular PE teachers, and they serve special education students in their classes, but they receive the same curriculum that everyone does. I said, great, that's good to know. That should be reported as a 0, okay? So if you have PE teachers, social workers, nurses, counselors, providing services, the same services to special ed students as they provide to everyone else, you would report 0 here. Okay? Only report the % of the time that they provide services specific to the needs of special ed students for their disabilities. So if you have a nurse who once a day for an hour works with a student, providing nursing services to that student, and it's an hour a day, then you would report 5 hours for the whole week divided by how many of other hours that nurse works. Okay? So it's very specific to services that students need because of their disabilities. It does not have to be on the IEP, but it can be. Okay? Now, one caveat to that are counselors. So if you have a high school counselor who's providing additional services to special ed students because of transition, you're helping them meet their transition goals specific to what is written into an IEP, you can count some of those hours, those additional hours, because the general education students are not receiving that additional counseling and assistance. So those are the kind of hours that you can count for counselors. Okay. Okay, so if you have questions about those as you're calculating, feel free to give us a call. We'll happily talk through your scenarios. Some of them can get pretty complicated, so we're happy to help you with those. So, how to calculate an FTE? First of all, only count personnel that were employed or on contract as of child count last year. So if you had a speech, an SLP, last fall providing services to students, but this spring you found that you needed to hire a second one because you had enough services that you needed to provide that you needed more personnel. You would only count the one from last fall. Don't count anyone who's been added since then, okay? So they had to be employed or on contract as of last October. Now, as I said, anyone employed or on contract should be counted. If you are not paying for the services, if you're not paying a co-op for the services, maybe they're provided by a local hospital, sort of pro bono, or they're offered as part of a counseling service, or Medicaid is paying for them, or anything like that, you would not count those individuals providing those services. Okay? Yes, 2018, child count 2018. So you need to count for any service provider, count the average hours served divided by either the school week, the school month, or the school year. So if you have someone who is providing services 1 hour per week, it would be 1 hour divided by 30 or 35 or 40, whatever would be the standard week. So you will probably find that a lot of your service providers are providing small percentages. It might be 0.05 as the calculation, or it might be 0.02. We've seen some of those, rather than a 0.5, which would be half-time, or a 1, which would be full-time. Don't report a 1 if you don't have a full-time, okay? Do the calculations for us. But if you have someone who comes in for 4 hours or 10 hours for the whole year, like a psychometrist might, and you only contract for 10 hours for the whole year, you can take that 10 divided by the full year of hours to calculate that, okay? So you don't need to try to convert that to a week. That gets really messy, more math than you really want to do. But you can calculate averages by week, by month, or by year. That is fine. And, you know, you may, if you really want to be precise, you can go back and look at the contract. You can go back and look at receipts for hours served. But if you have a rough estimate, you know, it's about 12 hours, that is okay too. We aggregate this data and report it federally. We don't use it for district purposes at this point. At some time, we may want to do that. But for now, we report the aggregated data, and it's a rough estimate. It's not, you know, it's not a perfectly precise measure. So they're just wondering what roughly states are providing. So go ahead and estimate that as close as possible, but you know, if you don't have precise numbers, that's okay. We do have an Fte Calculator. It's a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet that you can use, and that's on our website. So if you want some assistance, if you have a lot of staff and you don't want to calculate everything by hand, then you can go in and use that, and we can help you figure out how to use that if you're interested in that. Okay, any personnel questions? Again, just give us a call if you have specific questions. Oh, co-ops. So I don't know if any of you are in a co-op. If you are, you need to work with your co-op. Presumably your district pays the co-op for services. So you need to work with your co-op to figure out how much time their personnel are providing services to your kiddos. So yes, so if your school has a cooperative agreement with another district and you pay that district to provide services, you need to talk to that district and see how much time their service providers are working with you. If it's 0.5 of those service providers' time, or if it's 0.2, you will need to work with the co-op staff to figure that out. And we can help you do that too. But co-ops are a little bit trickier because one person may be shared across multiple districts, but is full-time for the co-op, but for each district only serves a portion of their time. Okay, so CEIS student reporting. There were only 8 districts last year that reserved funds for coordinated early intervening services. So for those 8 districts, they have to provide 2 numbers to us. They need to give us the count of students who received those services and the count of students who received services in the past but have moved to special education. So since there's so few of you, it's not likely that you will need to report this. If you do happen to report numbers and you're not one of the 8, we will basically ignore it. So it's okay if you're not quite sure what to report, just give us a call. Up to now, districts have done this voluntarily. So districts can set aside up to 15% of their special education funding for CEIS. And several districts have done that for many years. Moving forward, starting this fall, now I don't know how many of you follow regulatory changes at the federal level. This is a really important one that you may want to look into. But a few years ago, the former administration passed new guidance and regulations on calculating significant disproportionality. So that is a measure of, in 14 different categories, it's a measure of comparative risk ratios for identification, discipline, and placement. So a few years ago that was set in place. The new administration tried to delay it, and they put a delay in place through 2020. And that delay held through last fall. A couple of months ago, there was a court case, and a judge determined that the delay was not authorized. Okay, He struck down the delay. So now states and districts are required to implement as it was defined in the regulations. So until those regulations change, we must implement it as it is, which means that any districts that were found significantly disproportionate last fall, we sent out notifications in November. The 4-page letter and set of tables. There were 23 districts that were significantly disproportionate. Those 23 districts will be required to set aside 15% of their special education funding next year. And this falls under comprehensive CEIS. So we'll be sending out more information in the next month or so about this, but for those 23 districts, this is going to be a big change. So we are required to implement as defined in the regulations, and that means required set aside for those districts. But that will happen next year. So for now, the 8 districts that have to give us student numbers are these. If you are not one of these 8 districts, then you put zeros in those 2 boxes, okay? So under CEIS, just put zeros. We do not need any information. We do not need any data, okay? Just put your zeros in there. Any questions about CEIS? Okay, so that's everything on the district summary data page. If you have questions about that, let us know. Remember that that has to be fully completed by July 1. The next set of data that we will review is student level data, and all you need to do is review it. We will pull it ourselves. You do not need to submit a report. You do not need to send us counts of any of this data. We will pull it directly from your ed plan. So it's very, very important that you review it. If you do not review it and check that it's accurate and complete, we will assume that it is. We will pull the data. If there are missing data elements, you will be held liable for them. If the data is incorrect, you will be held liable for it. Okay? So if you don't check that your dropouts are correct, and you come back 6 months from now and say, but that data, my dropouts, they weren't all real dropouts, you should have checked your exit report and made sure that your exit reasons are correct. Okay? Okay, so data entered that we will review are the following. We review exiting reasons, we review secondary transition compliance, we review early childhood outcomes, discipline information, and for verification purposes, we will review the consent to eligibility timeline. Okay, so make sure all of that is correct. Now, we had a previous question about when you reactivate a student to update information, what is the code or reason to inactivate them? You use the same reason, and then you have to delete the reactivation and the exit from the student history. Otherwise, very likely the exiting reason will show that it is missing, and it won't show on your reports or on the student's information. So anytime you have multiple exits in a row because you've reactivated for some reason, you have to delete those extra exits and reactivations. So for exiting, we have to report the count of students who exited district and their reasons for exit, and we only report ages 14 through 21. We will report a 22-year-old if you happen to have any of those, okay? So we use this information, and OSEP uses this information for the dropout report, and that's why it's 14 to 21. The reasons for exit that we include: dropped out and unknown, deceased, exceeded max age. You should only report exceeded max age if the student is 22. If they are less than 22, you cannot use this exit reason. It's considered a non-compliant reason. You can't exit max age at 20 or 21. We have seen some districts do that, and that is not correct. Graduated with diploma and then transferred to another school system. We will also report, as return to regular ed, we will report any students that have accepted a Lindsay Nicole Henry scholarship or who have returned to homeschooling. Okay, so last year we had to report homeschooling as a dropout because of Oklahoma regulations. Fortunately, this year OSEP issued a memo that all states, not just Oklahoma, so this helps, all states are to report homeschool as return to regular ed, okay? So your homeschool students, when you exit them as return to homeschool, we will report them as return to regular ed. Now, with homeschooling, you need to be careful and you need to verify with families. If it's a student who says, I'm going to go and, my parents are going to educate me at home, check to make sure that they're not going to a virtual school. If they're going to a virtual school, it is considered transfer to another school system. Okay, so you would exit them as a transfer instead of exit to homeschool. With LNH, if the parents don't tell you, they have to tell you because you have documentation that they must fill out. They essentially give up their rights to special education. They have to sign some waivers and some other things. So there will be paperwork for LNH. And Stacy here at our office would be sending you that information. If you have students who you have determined no longer need special education services, you would go through the non-eligibility process, complete their paperwork, etc., finalize that non-eligibility, but you would not exit them from Ed Plan. Okay, they remain an active student in your district, so they remain active in Ed Plan, but they would have their non-eligibility recorded. Okay, so don't exit those students. Yes, we have an exiting report in Ed Plan, and that's where you can find your list of students who have been exited. And that's in advanced reporting. So notes on exit. Make sure you enter your correct exit dates and exit reasons. Some of you may or may not know this, but it's really easy to update exit information. You do not need to reactivate the student to change exit information. So when you go to the inactive student list and you find your inactive student, you open up the record, and at the top there will be a little button that says Exit Info. Click on Exit Info and change the exit reason or the date, or both if you need to. Okay, but that's the easiest way to correct that. It will automatically update the student history page with the new information, and reports will pull that information in a day or two. So we highly recommend that you do not reactivate and then inactivate, because that causes other problems that you have to clean up. You can correct that and change those directly from the inactive record. Again, unknown should be used as a temporary exit status. Once you know where they've gone or what they've done, or if they are a true dropout, then you need to change that exit status. Hopefully all of you have students who are graduating this year. If you do, you need to make sure that you exit those students prior to June 30th. Okay, so if you have graduates this month, maybe in June, be sure to exit those before June 30th, or they will not show on your exiting report and they will not count toward the calculations for dropout. Okay, so make sure you do that. The exception to that would be a student who needs to go to summer school this year and will not actually graduate until the fall. Wait to report that graduate. That would be a graduate for next year. Okay. So if you are a K-8 school, do not exit your 8th graders as graduating with a diploma. They are not graduating with a high school diploma. They're simply transferring to another school district. You don't even need to exit them at all. They will be pulled to the other districts at transfer time. So just let them be. They will sit in your system until the new district pulls them. Okay. The last note on here is related to two things. Okay. So if you have a high school student who is graduating and their IEP is due after they graduate, then exit them on the date of graduation. You do not need to refinalize the IEP. As long as the IEP is current at exit, then that student will be compliant and their records will be compliant for secondary transition. However, if you have a student who will exit after the IEP is due, you must refinalize the IEP or they will be non-compliant for secondary transition. Okay, so make sure you check those. Any other questions about exiting? Okay, and again, all of these, all of the student level data that we're pulling, we have reports and advanced reporting that you can use. They are all in the end of year folder. So we have a report for exiting, we have a report for secondary transition, we have one for early childhood outcomes, and one for discipline. So for secondary transition, this is our third 100% compliance indicator that we have to report this time of year. We have to report the percentage of students whose IEPs meet all of these 8 secondary transition requirements. Okay, these are not requirements for graduation, these are secondary transition requirements. So make sure you distinguish between those. We had a question earlier about, wait, she didn't mention the summary of performance. No, summary of performance is a requirement for graduation, not for secondary transition. Okay, so these 8 are in IDEA. IEPs must meet these secondary transition requirements. We do not, in Oklahoma, actually check specifically for end-of-year reporting and for compliance reporting purposes whether all of these have been met. Instead, we use a shortcut. So as you probably know, any IEP for a student who is 9th grade and older or 16 and older has to have the transition section in the IEP completed prior to it being finalized. So when you finalize one of their IEPs, first you have to complete transition information or you won't be able to finalize it. Okay, we call that a rule of completion. And if it's not completed, then you can't finalize. So we use that rule of completion as our shorthand for this. So if you are able to finalize the IEP, we count that final IEP as a compliant IEP because of the rules of completion. So what that means is that any IEPs that are due prior to June 30th for your secondary students, they must have an up-to-date IEP. For these students, you should always have an up-to-date, well, any student, you should have an up-to-date IEP. They should never run overdue, okay? But for compliance purposes for this indicator, if you have an out-of-date IEP, you will be considered non-compliant. And last year we had many districts who they didn't finalize their IEPs for these students, and they were non-compliant and had to complete a lot of other paperwork to resolve that. Okay, so make sure any IEPs that are due prior to June 30th for this age group have to be refinalized before then. If you have an IEP that is due in July, then you can wait for that one, okay, because that will be due next fiscal year. Okay, so again, this is 100% compliance. Most districts meet that, but we do have a few every year that don't get those refinalized. Okay, so early childhood data, we have 2 things that we typically report for this. We have early childhood outcomes and EC environments. EC environments, we report it with child count in the fall, so we won't talk about that at this point. But early childhood outcomes, we have to report how much students have learned. Okay, so it's basically a pre-post evaluation, and we report where they came in and how they ended with regard to those 3 outcomes for early childhood data. We use the COSIF form, Early Childhood Outcome Summary form, to record that information. So we only report kiddos who meet 2 criteria. The first criteria is that they had to have turned 6 during this past school year. So any student who turned 6 between July 1 of last year and June 30th of this year will be reported, as long as they have had at least 6 months of service. Okay? So if you had a student come in to kindergarten and they didn't get evaluated for an IEP until after they were 5½, then you would not, that student would not be reported here because they didn't have 6 months of service prior to the age of 6. So if you have kiddos who come into your program this past year between the ages of 3 and 5½, make sure they have their entrance ratings. If they turn 6 this year, make sure they have their exit ratings. Okay, it's really important that you put that in there. We will count incomplete data as non-compliant, okay? And that will count against your performance measures on your determination. ECOs are on that report on the determination as a measure of program quality for early childhood, so make sure you complete that data. So if you have kiddos who turned or will turn 6 prior to June 30th, you need to enter their exit ratings and their exit date. If you have kiddos who will turn 6 after June 30th, they will be counted next year. So you can either enter your data now or you can wait. We will not pull them until next year. So again, we have a report for this. It's the Early Childhood Outcomes Report and Advanced Reporting. It will give you a lot of information about what data is missing and what you need to do to correct that. So again, that ECO form, the COSA form, just rate all 3 outcomes. There's the 3, the social and emotional, acquiring and using knowledge and skills, and then taking appropriate action to meet needs. Okay? So all 3 of those need to be completed. You need to record whether progress was made, and you need to list the entry and exit dates. Now, we get questions about this a lot. The entrance date should match the date of the IEP, the original IEP, initial IEP, either at 3 or 5 or whenever they first started receiving services. The exit date should be as close to their 6th birthday as possible. You know, if they turn 6 over the summer, you can use the last day of school, that's fine. But you want to make sure that they got at least 6 months of service between that entrance date and exit date so that that kiddo can be counted for your district. Okay? Any questions about ECOs? Okay. The last set that we'll talk about that we will pull is discipline. So we have to report all disciplinary removals for students with IEPs of all ages, from 3 to 22, according to certain OSEP reporting requirements. So they count removals differently than some districts do. So it's important to recognize that your district may not count something as a removal, but you have to report it as a removal per OSEP guidelines. Okay? So we'll go through those. The 4 types of disciplinary removals that you need to report: in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, something called unilateral removal to interim alternative educational setting, very long-term, and these are usually for the most serious offenses: drugs, weapons, serious bodily injury, okay? And then removal by hearing officer. So the latter 2 types are not very common across Oklahoma. They may happen once in a while. If they happen, you probably know they're going to be a serious offense with a serious solution to that, okay? So if you have questions about that, feel free to give us a call, but those you probably will be able to recognize immediately. Out-of-school suspensions are fairly straightforward too, okay? Anytime you send a student home for disciplinary reasons, that is an out-of-school suspension. Even if it's the last hour of the day, because you're trying to discipline their behavior, if you call their parents and tell the parents to come get them for disciplinary reasons, it is considered an out-of-school suspension, and you need to report it as a removal. In-school suspensions are the hardest type to report. So we have mainly because in a lot of districts, what OSEP considers a removal, districts may not count as a removal. Okay, so we're counting these de facto suspensions because you may not call it a suspension in your district. But a de facto suspension includes several different cases, and some of these you may consider that all right. But if you remove a student from their usual classroom, their usual placement, for disciplinary purposes, you must count it as a removal. So if you send a student to the principal's office for half a day, that's a suspension. Yes, there's a discipline report and advanced reporting. If you send a student to the library for half a day for disciplinary reasons, that's a suspension. If you remove a student from their general ed classroom where they typically are and send them to the special ed classroom for the rest of the day for disciplinary reasons, it is considered a suspension and should be reported as such. Okay? Now, that does not include special cases where, there's a behavioral plan that says if the student starts to act up, they can be, they can go to the special education room to help resolve their behavioral concerns, however you want to say that. That would not be a suspension because it's included in the IEP. But for any other reason, if you remove a student from their usual placement for disciplinary reasons, you must count that as a removal. Okay? Now, the only caveat to that is the time frame. So if you have a student who was removed for 1 hour throughout the whole year, okay, 1 hour last fall, it was a bad afternoon, they were sent to the principal's office for an hour, and that was their only removal, you would not need to report that because we only report students' removals that accumulate to more than half a day, okay? So if Johnny only had a 1 hour removal for the whole year, we would not even report that federally, so you don't need to report it to us. However, if Johnny had 1 hour removal in September and an hour removal in October and an hour removal every single month throughout the year, you would need to report every single one of those removals because over time, those hours would accumulate to more than half a day. So you need to make sure that you look at your students' records and determine whether the overall time of removals was more than half a day. Now, you can just put everything into the system and we can remove those for you. That's fine. We don't mind doing that. We'll just exclude anything less than half a day. If it's easier for you to put those in and not track that, that's perfectly fine. We do not mind doing that. But that's just to let you know that those short periods of time for students who do not have at least half a day of removal throughout the year, we will not be reporting those. Okay? And that includes in school and out of school in any form. So if it's half a day, a couple hours of in school and a couple hours of out of school, if that together counts to more than half a day, you need to include them. So there are two ways you can enter discipline. This slide shows the student-by-student method. So you would open up the student's record, open up discipline information. You'll have to report whether services were provided, and then click OK, and this tab will pull up. You enter your removal information, the days, the date, discipline begins, and so forth. So if you just have a few removals to report, this is the easiest way. You just go student by student, report each removal. However, if you have a lot of removals to report, or if you have several over the whole year that you haven't, you haven't been tracking over time, and you have a lot to report right now, we do have templates that you can use to auto-upload all removals at once. And this would apply to inactive students also. So any student who had, let's say you had a student last fall who has since left your district, but you need to report several removals for them, or one removal for more than half a day, then using the templates is the easiest way to do that so you don't have to make the record. So those templates are on our website, and we're very happy to walk you through those. If you have questions on how to use them, they have to be used very precisely, or else it will mess up all records and you'll have to delete them in order to correct them. So this is the only problem with the discipline information. You cannot correct an active discipline record. You have to delete it and recreate it. So make sure you enter them correctly the first time so you don't have to do that. That's a lot of work, and we want to avoid extra work when we can. So make sure those are correct when you enter them the first time. We do have guidance available. Okay, this is our data website. We have discipline guidance for you. We even have a document called Special Education Discipline for Principals. It's like 5 pages. You can give that to your principals so that they know how special education students' discipline has to be reported. And it may be useful for you too. It's sort of a flow chart of decisions. It just asks you a series of questions. Did this happen? If yes, go here. If no, go over there, okay? And it just walks you through those decisions based on a certain number of questions. We also have the end-of-year data collection manual, and that discipline information is in there also, okay? Any other discipline questions? Okay. So again, you need to enter your discipline. We cannot collect it from student information systems yet because half the districts, well, maybe not half, a certain portion of districts in the state do not even report their discipline to the state. So we cannot use those. We have to rely on you all to report that discipline to us. Okay, so for certification, your superintendents have to certify between July 2nd and July 16th. Certification happens in single sign-on on the special education child count system. It does not happen in EdPlan. And the reason for that is if we were to put a certification function into EdPlan, it would cost the state a lot of money. So we're relying on the free system that we have now, single sign-on, to do that. Note, though, that there will be no data in there. So if your superintendent goes in there and says, there's no data for me to review, where is it? You need to give them the data that you have from EdPlan. So you'll want to give them the exiting report, secondary transition report, maybe a discipline report, or the early childhood outcomes report. You certainly want to give them the district summary data page so that they can see all of the data and review it and make sure that it's correct, because that's what they are certifying. Data will not freeze in EdPlan, so whatever we collect on July 1 is considered final. So you want to make sure that you have a copy of that in your reports so that you know what we collected, because by October it could change and it will not look the same. So you need to make sure you have copies of that. So this is what they're essentially certifying. They certify the completeness and accuracy of everything you're doing. They're certifying that exit dates and reasons are correct, that early childhood outcomes are correct, that you are compliant on secondary transition, that all disciplinary removals have been reported correctly. They're certifying your personnel FTE counts, your initial consent counts and causes for delay, and your early childhood transition counts and causes for delay. Okay? So make sure those are correct for your superintendents to certify. If they do not certify by July 16th, it will be considered untimely. Okay. So this is some of the information we have on our website. We have the end-of-year data collection manual. It walks through all of these indicators, gives you some information on them, how to report them, how to calculate things. Okay, very useful document. It's just been updated, so it's fully up to date. We have discipline walkthrough, that decision tree, okay, the discipline for principals document. We have the early childhood environments and outcomes information, quite a bit on early childhood under the 619 section. We have the templates for non-compliance submission, those Excel templates for student lists for 45-day timeline and the EC transition delays. Please use those for submissions. We have the discipline uploads, and we have the personnel FTE calculator. So if you have questions about all of those, we also now have the webinar from a couple weeks ago posted. We have copies of the slides, so feel free to look at those, refer to those over time. If you have questions about them, feel free to give us a call, and we will be happy to answer your questions. Okay, so this question about special education teachers, you should be inactivating. You don't necessarily have to exit them, but you should inactivate any teacher, remove their access, maybe change the password or something so that they cannot access EdPlan. You should do that immediately upon when someone in your district leaves so that they do not have access to private information any longer. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so very briefly, advanced reporting tools. So to get to advanced reporting, you go to EdPlan. You open the reporting tab and click on advanced reporting. It will open up a new window. It doesn't look like anything in EdPlan, okay? So it's a completely new window. It's just a white box with some folders. Click on OK Reports, open up the library folder, and then the end of year folder. In that end of year folder will be the following reports. We have an eligibility timeline report, early childhood transition report. These first two are for your information only, okay? They are not accurate enough yet for us to use for reporting purposes, so when you look at them, you may see kids on there that you think should not be there. That's okay. They're there for your information only. We will use them to verify certain pieces of information, but we do not use them for reporting. We rely on you to self-submit that information on the district summary data page. However, we do use the exiting report, secondary transition report, ECO's report, and the discipline incident report for federal reporting. So what you see on those is what we see. Any errors that are on those reports, those students may not be counted toward your final, okay? So make sure it's correct. Secondary transition, if you have kiddos whose IEPs are out of date, you will be considered non-compliant. ECOs, any students who have missing data, they will be considered non-compliant for the performance calculations. So make sure those reports are correct, that information on them is accurate. On the red flags reports, make sure that those are resolved. Okay, it's very important that you take care of those. Okay, any other questions at this point? You are free to contact us at any time. Travis, Tristan, and I are glad to help. You can email or give us a call. We will have open doors in a few weeks. You may attend those if you need specific one-on-one assistance. Otherwise, just give us a call and we will gladly look at your data, see if everything has been resolved, and then you can be finished. So, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to looking at your data. Thank you.